Facing a harsh reality, rising inequality, skyrocketing housing costs, and growing unemployment. Despite strong economic indicators, millions of Canadians are struggling to make ends meet. So how is it that a country's key economic metrics can show progress, yet its ever-growing population feels like it's stuck in a recession? To understand what's really happening, we need to dig deeper, beyond the headlines, and explore how population growth, productivity, and resource dependency are reshaping Canada's economy. Let's start by breaking down the numbers. Imagine you and your friends have a lemonade stand that earns $100 in a day. When you look at how much money the stand made, that's your GDP. But when you look at how much each person made, everyone gets an equally distributed amount of $20. This $20 is your GDP per capita. It's how much each individual earns. So, while GDP tells us the total, GDP per capita tells us the average per person. If more friends join the stand and the earnings stay the same, the GDP remains the same. But the GDP per capita goes down because there's less money for each person. So, while Canada's GDP might give the impression of a healthy economy, when we adjust for the population with GDP per capita, we see a different story. This leads us to a key factor contributing to this discrepancy: the rapid population growth driven by Canada's immigration policies. In 2016, Donald Trump was elected President of the United States for the first time. His campaign endorsed strict immigration policies and bans that would deprive many of the U.S. residents of the American dream. So what did they do? They started applying for permanent residency in Canada. According to CTV, in 2015, a little over 6,800 Americans tried to apply for permanent residency in Canada, followed by just over 7,700 in 2016. In 2017, the year of Trump's inauguration, that figure jumped to over 9,000. It's not just that people wanted to avoid Trump's presidency, but it also shows how Canada is everyone's go-to destination because of their immigration policies. While American immigration to Canada surged during this period, it was just a small fraction of the larger global migration trend. From 2016 to 2021, over 1.3 million people immigrated to Canada. Then in 2021, Canada made some immigration policy changes, leading to 500,000 immigrants moving to Canada in just 1 year. As of 2023, there were more than 8 million immigrants with permanent residence living in Canada, almost 23% of the total population. Ontario was the leading destination for immigrants, with 44% of new permanent residents settling there between 2016 and 2021. Currently, annual immigration in Canada amounts to almost 500,000 new immigrants, one of the highest rates per population of any country in the world. One of the reasons why we're looking at specifically 2016-2021 is because this was the first tenure of Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, a man who made Canada immigrant-friendly. This was Trudeau's solution to counter challenges left by his predecessors like labor shortages and a declining birth rate. Even during the COVID-19 pandemic, when the whole world had travel bans and lockdowns, he continued to support his immigration policies.
Now, Canada remains one of the only countries in the world where citizens are, by and large, positively inclined towards immigration.
And it actually worked. The GDP and employment rate grew a lot during his tenure, and of course, there was a drastic drop at the start of COVID-19. But that was the case globally, so we can't really factor that here. So prior to COVID-19, Trudeau's policy on high immigration undoubtedly boosted Canada's overall economic output, but it's only one piece of the puzzle. The real question is whether this growth translates into productivity gains, and that's where Canada faces some unique challenges. According to the Census Division of Canada in July 2022, the population distribution map shows that nearly 80% of Canada's population lives below this line. While many think that it's because of climate preference or lifestyle choice, the real reason is that these states border the U.S. To understand why, let's imagine a guy named Joe who lives in Vancouver, British Columbia, which shares a border with the state of Washington in the U.S., which has a popular city named Seattle. Joe is in the market for a job and has no trouble commuting to work, which means he can easily commute through the border in case he gets hired in Seattle. So let's compare the two. The unemployment rate in Vancouver is 6.4%, while it is 4.8% in Seattle. The household income in Seattle is 56% more than it is in Vancouver and is 35% above the national average. So it's an obvious pick here that Joe will go for a job in Seattle since it's a more rewarding opportunity. On top of that, he'll plan on moving closer to his workplace instead of making the commute of 2.5 hours every single day. The problem is that Seattle is 20.3% more expensive than Vancouver. But instead of moving to Seattle, he can opt for a city that is closest like Renton in Washington, which is 4.4% cheaper than the cost of living in Vancouver. Once we understand this dilemma with Joe, we start to uncover and understand the biggest problem in Canada's economy. As of 2024, Canada has about 1.3 million businesses, which does not include holding companies and businesses with no employees. 99.8% of these businesses are small businesses, and there are only 4,000 large corporations in Canada, which means businesses with more than 500 employees. There are 50,000 startups in Canada that employ 250,000 people, which is just 2% of the total private sector workforce. And surprisingly, 35% of Canadian businesses don't have an online presence. These numbers are relatively weak compared to their southern neighbors. Speaking of southern neighbors, in 2021, 52.3% of foreign-controlled assets in Canada were owned by the United States alone, and according to a Statistics Canada report in 2023, the share of assets owned by foreign-controlled enterprises in Canada is 14.9%. Part of the reason Americans establish businesses in Canada is because the wages there are lower compared to the US, which is good for them, but bad for Canada's economy. This leads us to a popular term used to describe immigration due to better opportunities called brain drain. According to research by Brock University, 66% of software engineering, 30% of computer science, and 30% of computer engineering students emigrated after completing their programs. And of course, nearly 81.51% chose the United States as their work destination. Cities like California, Washington State, and New York were preferred, which are home to large multinational technology firms like Amazon and Google. The three biggest reasons for this brain drain are higher pay, firm reputation, and the scope of work. The irony here is that while Canadians are rushing off to the US because of brain drain, citizens of countries like India, China, Afghanistan, Pakistan, and Nigeria are rushing off to Canada for the same reason. According to data from 2022, India accounted for approximately 118,095 new permanent residents, making it the most significant source of immigration. So while they are maintaining an inflow of immigrants in the country, they're not able to balance them out with employment and housing, which is leading to productivity challenges. Part of why productivity remains an issue in Canada comes down to which sectors drive the economy. Unlike tech-heavy or service-driven economies, Canada relies heavily on resource sectors like oil and gas, which face their own limitations in driving per capita growth. Canada is one of the world's largest energy producers, exporting more energy than it needs. However, Canada's energy intensity is high due to its large landmass, cold climate, and industrial structure. And since they're blessed with such natural resources, Canada's economy significantly relies on it, particularly oil, gas, and mining. Natural resources account for approximately 11% of Canada's GDP and about 1/3 of its exports. This reliance is particularly pronounced in provinces like Alberta and Saskatchewan, where the resource sector plays a critical role in economic activity, but only to some extent. The natural resource sector accounted for approximately 1.7 million jobs in Canada, including both direct and indirect employment. This includes the energy sector having 648,000 jobs, the minerals and metals sector having 694,000 jobs, and the forest sector having 382,000 jobs. But here's where the trouble comes in. The heavy reliance on commodities makes Canada vulnerable to price volatility. For example, fluctuations in global oil prices can lead to significant changes in government revenues and economic stability. The capital-intensive nature of resource industries means they often create fewer jobs compared to other sectors like technology or manufacturing, which can lead to lower overall employment levels. The reliance on resource industries can depress GDP per capita since these sectors typically offer lower economic contributions per worker compared to knowledge-based industries. In 2022, despite a robust natural resource sector, Canada's GDP per capita was affected by the limited job creation capacity of these industries. Sure, they are contributing to the sustainability of the GDP, but of course, it's the GDP per capita that shows the real face of the economy. As of early 2024, Canada's GDP per capita was reported to be around $45,036, indicating fluctuations and a potential decline from the peak observed in 2021. Based on the trend we've been seeing alongside other things, Canada has now entered into what economists refer to as a GDP per capita recession. You can tell a country is about to enter recession if it ticks the following boxes. Firstly, there's a drop in GDP. We've established that GDP doesn't factor in population size, which contributes to unequal income distribution. So instead of looking at GDP, we'll look at GDP per capita, where we're seeing a drop in the last 2 quarters. Secondly, there's rising unemployment. Thirdly, there's less consumer spending, which is the case because of inflation. Lastly, there's lower business activity, as many businesses have either not fully recovered since the pandemic or haven't gotten any incentive to build in Canada. Putting all this together and forecasting what the 2024 stats of Canada are about to look like, it is safe to say that Canada is facing a GDP per capita recession. It's primarily because of stagnation in living standards and productivity issues, which is triggering the flight or fight response of Canadians, leaving them no choice but to take flight. If these trends continue without recovery in 2025, this period could become one of the most prolonged declines in per-person GDP observed in history. How do you think Canada can strike a balance between welcoming immigrants and maintaining economic stability for its residents? And if you think Canada's over-reliance on resource-based industries is ludicrous, you should definitely check out our video on the German economy, where we get to see a prime example of over-reliance, but in a bizarre way. See you there.